Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this audio presentation, we're going to continue our conversation about external financing and deal making. We're going to talk about the basics of the investor pitch and the investment deal, and then I'm going to give you the information for your Canvas activity. So the development of an effective pitch for raising investment capital is very much an art form, but there are some elements of it that are pretty consistent regardless of the industry, the sector, the stage of the business, or your team and the opportunity. Your textbook describes the story that should go into a pitch. And this is important. A pitch is fundamentally a narrative. It's a story about why someone should invest their capital into your opportunity. And this is part of why I don't teach pitching in courses. Pitching is very much a personal process, learning to use your communication skills in a way that works for you. And while there are some basics for good presenting and good stage presence and communication skills, those are highly specific and are usually taught in a communications class. We don't have the option in these entrepreneurship courses to spend enough time teaching the necessary pitching skills in order to make it part of the assessment of the course. Most people arrive at a course like this with a set of presentation capabilities, and it's very hard to build those in the context of a course about entrepreneurship. So if this is something you're interested in, there are many courses that you could take, whether at the university or elsewhere, on stage presence and presentation and public speaking, and all of those can be very valuable. But the critical part that I want you to understand is that the presentation itself has to tell an efficient and effective and compelling story. And the classic way of doing that in the context of raising venture capital is to describe a problem that customers need to solve. Here is something out there that isn't being addressed effectively right now. The second piece is there are lots of customers that we can identify directly who have this problem, and they're prepared to spend money to resolve it. Then you're basically saying we can solve it, right? So here's a viable business model with the technology and the necessary operational plan that can actually take this solution and make it available to the customers who are prepared to pay for it. And then finally, and in many cases, the most important piece of the pitch is this team can do this. And this is often the big surprise to a lot of entrepreneurs is how important this is to potential investors. But the single biggest determinant that investors will consider in whether an entrepreneurial team is to be trusted is whether they've done it before. And that might not seem very fair, of course, because everybody's got to have a first venture deal. But the question is, have you pulled together a team? So you may never have done a deal before. You may never have scaled up a company, but you can bring a team together around you that brings the necessary expertise and fills the gaps. And that's what an investment group is going to look for in terms of the overall team's capabilities. The actual slides that are presented in a pitch deck are often very straightforward, and your textbook provides a 10-slide presentation that I think is actually pretty straightforward and pretty standard. I've put together dozens and dozens of pitch decks. I've reviewed hundreds of pitch decks, whether on investment committees or as part of competitions or simply for classes. And this is pretty straightforward. Clearly, you may have more than 10 slides, but starting with 10 is a pretty good way to go. You can always add more at the end in an appendix. You can always provide more data later on. But keeping in mind this idea of keeping it pretty short is usually a very helpful way to develop the first couple drafts of the pitch deck. The order of the pitch deck, perhaps more flexible. I like this particular order where you're explaining who you are, then you go straight to the leader, team, and prior experience. This is such an essential component of what investors are looking for. I know that in many pitch decks, the team is saved till the very end. I think that's always a mistake. I think you lead with the strengths of the team. Then you go into the problem and then the solution. Very often technology entrepreneurs think the first thing they should do is explain their technology, and that's usually the last thing that investors actually want to hear about. So I've given you a link for some examples of great pitch decks. If you Google great pitch decks, you'll get all sorts of websites that have compiled classic pitch decks, everything from Facebook to Twitter and all sorts of others. For your Canvas activity, you'll need to pick one of these and then go through it in more detail, and then identify some of the things that it does well or doesn't do as well in order to get credit. So you can do that now by simply pausing this presentation, or you can do this obviously at the end. Getting into the actual negotiating of a deal is quite complicated. So I'm pointing out a couple of different things here. One, sort of a framework for negotiating, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific deal terms and some content that will be helpful for you as you're thinking about how these deals actually get made. I am a very big fan of this framework called Getting to Yes, which was developed out of the Harvard Negotiation Project. The idea behind it is that you apply a framework to your negotiation with specific principles and goals. And I feel like this is an extremely important way, especially for novice entrepreneurs, to approach the negotiating process. Remember that this isn't supposed to be about you, and it isn't supposed to be about how you feel about the technology or the money that you need. This is meant to be about the specific purposes and intentions of the parties and what their goals are. So if you have time and interest in this, I really strongly encourage you to read this book. It's extremely well written and very, very clear. It goes against some classic aspects of negotiations. Things like if you know you want to settle on a price of X, then you should start your bidding at 2X in order to, because you'll assume the other party will, deal you down. This framework does not work for everyone. There are many people I know who are not happy with this particular framework. But I think that recognizing it and recognizing the potential that it has to help you actually negotiate for the things that are important is really, really valuable. So I encourage you, it's mentioned in the textbook, but I encourage you to consider tackling this as maybe a reading opportunity after the course. So with that in mind, I wanted to provide you with some content that will help you as you think about negotiating term sheets and understanding a deal. A term sheet is a list of terms, obviously, this sort of the summary or outline of the overall deal. Keep in mind that an actual agreed investment document can run anywhere from 5 to 500 pages, depending on the stage you're at, the challenges and difficulties, provisions, and so on and so forth. These two documents here, a primer document I found on the University of North Carolina website, but with no author attributed to it. I did read through it, and I think it's a good common sense introduction to a lot of the key terms. And then Cooley, which is arguably the top venture law firm in the United States, has a nice website in which they talk about negotiating some of the key term sheet details. So please download the primer and have a read through it, and then take a look at the negotiating guidance on Cooley, because this will give you some really nice background as you're thinking about how these deals get done. From there, I want to give you a couple of elements of guidance on this process, and then I'll give you 2 more resources that will be useful to you. There's sort of a series of elements that go along with a basic term sheet. So I'm going to just very quickly walk through these. The type of investment. Is this a stock deal? That is someone buying ownership of the company? Or is it a debt deal? Or is it some combination? How much are they investing? Literally just, is this a $1 million investment? Is it a $20,000 investment? What is the valuation of the company at the time that the money is going in? And usually that's expressed both pre-money and post-money. If this is only part of a deal, then it's usually going to be expressed pre-money. And what ownership stake, either how many shares are being sold or what % ownership will the investors have. If it's preferred stock, which is getting a little more complicated, then is there a liquidation preference? That is, if there's an exit event, do these investors get their money out first? Is there a stock option pool? This is usually something that needs to be negotiated as part of the deal. how much stock is being set aside as incentives for employees. What voting rights do the investors have? Do they have voting rights? Do they have special voting rights? And what governance elements are being put into place here as well. That could include a board position for the investor or board observer status. That is, they get to see what happens at the board meetings, but they don't vote on the board. Do they have veto power? It's very common for investors to demand veto power over future investments. That prevents situations in which the company raises more money in a way that's detrimental to that investor. What information rights do they have? Can they demand information? How regularly do they get information? And other notifications about what's going on with the company. The keys to successfully negotiating these kinds of terms are to try to align the incentives of all of the parties. And there really are three, right? There's the company, right? The entity itself. There's the founders and the key employees. We often confuse those as being the same as the company. And at the very, very beginning, they may seem like they're the same because there's only like one founder and one key employee or something like that. But realistically, the entity is separate from its founders and key employees. And then, of course, the investors themselves. The more effectively you can align everyone's incentives, the more likely that everyone will reach deal terms that they can accept. You want to try to link responsibility to rewards. That is, people should be responsible for the things that they're ultimately going to get rewarded for. And in the case of technology ventures, that's most commonly, number one, getting the product to customers and confirming that they like it and will pay for it. And number two, scaling the organization effectively. So both of those things require capital, usually, but they also require effective operations. You also want to link accountability to control. That is, the things that people should be held accountable for are things that they should have control over. Very commonly, we see term sheets in which there are milestones or status reports, outcomes for which the people who are theoretically in charge have no control over. And those are really problematic situations because whenever you have someone who's accountable for something they don't have control over, they have no incentive anymore. Benchmarking is critical at these stages. Look at other deals, look at other companies, find out what these kinds of deals have looked like in the past and what term sheets other term sheets that have been successfully closed, the kind of language that they use and how they address these kinds of problems. Finally, I really want to encourage you to focus on the long-term relationship. Your relationship with your investor doesn't end when they give you the money, it begins when they give you the money. And the comment that I often make to entrepreneurs is, your relationship with your investor is not going to get better after you start spending their money. As you begin spending their money, their expectations go up. And if you don't build that relationship with the long haul in mind, it is very likely that that relationship will go sour very, very quickly. I've seen many situations in which entrepreneurs are so focused on getting the money in, they don't realize that they're setting themselves up for failure. Keep in mind that if you need to raise more money, the first thing that potential new investors will want to do is talk to your current investors. And if your current investors say, I wish I hadn't put my money in now, your new investors are going to just walk away. So here are two really useful resources for you from two different organizations. The National Venture Capital Association is obviously an association of venture capitalists, and they have one perspective on the world, which is good to be aware of. They have, to their credit, put together a set of model legal documents that they recommend that venture capital firms and entrepreneurs use. Those are open access. You can simply go straight to the website or click directly to get their model term sheet. On the other hand, you have Y Combinator, which is a California-based company that's an accelerator that's designed to help get early-stage companies off the ground. They provide a series of resources that's also very, very useful. Their term sheet is fascinating because it's unbelievably short. It's just barely over 1 page long. And it really does focus in on the absolute most critical things. It's probably too simple for most real deals, but it's a really good starting point. And I think that's what this is really meant to accomplish, is to say, look, let's figure out the really big stuff first, and then the details can get sorted out as we go. So please download both these resources. I think you'll you'll find that they're useful for you to have in your, maybe just upload them to a Google Drive account or something like that. So that brings us then to your final Canvas activity, which is in two parts. You're going to be using PitchBook, which is a fantastic resource that you have access to as a UW-Madison student. It's available in the Canvas module. You'll need to sign up with your wisc.edu email address. Once you've done that, the first part of this activity is find a deal in PitchBook. Any deal you want. You can look them up by company name, by sector. Please don't look up things like Facebook. I'm sure it's in there. I've never actually looked for it myself, but it's so big and so complicated, and it's just not going to be worthwhile. Look for something smaller. Look for something interesting. You can search by sector, by city, by all sorts of different things, but find a deal. And you're going to just report out a certain amount of information, the name, what industry it's in, and then identify at least one round of funding that took place for that company, how much was invested, who the lead investor was, and then note whether there was an exit for that company. That is, did it sell, did it IPO, did it go bankrupt, something along those lines. So this is just basically a reporting effort so that you can practice kind of using PitchBook. PitchBook references United States and other national databases where companies have to register information when they raise private capital. So it's an incredible resource. It's unbelievably expensive to access if you're on your own, so you're very lucky to have access to it as a student. The second part is a little more specific, is going to require you to do a little thinking. You're going to look up Norides Corporation, and Norides is one of the companies that I co-founded a while back, and it has already exited. And so the information in there is now, set in stone. It's never going to change. And you're going to then report the funding rounds for Norides Corporation, a little bit of the information about each of those funding rounds. And then what I want you to do is to use whatever knowledge you have, whether it's your textbook, technology ventures, the internet more generally, maybe from some searching you do. If you have background experience, that's fantastic. If you've got some math, if you've got some comfort with math and you'd like to do a few calculations, maybe you're familiar with some things like discounted cash flow or internal rates of return, that's fantastic. I would like you to use whatever you can to discuss whether you think that this was a successful technology venture. Now, clearly this company exited, and so in some definitions, right off the bat, you can say, well, this must have been a success because it had an exit event, and that's a good starting point. But I want you to use the data that's available to you in PitchBook, and whatever tools you can bring to bear, and whatever you can is fine. I'm not expecting, a financial analysis worthy of a venture capital firm or an investment bank or anything like that, but just some thoughtful perspective on what you think, given the information that's in PitchBook. From a founder or company perspective, was it a successful venture? And from an investor perspective, and you might think about the different kinds of investors who appear to have participated in this deal. And so make sure you come to some conclusions. Please, I'm not a big fan of, sometimes at the university in the School of Business, we encourage seeing all sides, which is, well, you could look at it this way and you could look at it that way, and then you're welcome to point those things out, but I want you to come to some conclusions. Based on the information that you have and your knowledge, I would like you to clearly state your conclusions based off the information that's available. So this concludes our conversation about private capital and investment funding and deals. And I hope that all of this has given you a sense of what it's like what the funding process is and the funding options for technology ventures. This is a huge, huge topic. We could easily spend an entire semester, and some universities, in fact, have entire courses on venture funding that spends an entire semester just covering this topic. So you're really just scratching the surface. And to the extent that this is a topic that you're going to get more interested in, whether because you're going to have an entrepreneurial venture that needs private funding or because you're interested in venture capital more generally, you're going to want to find that there's a myriad of resources out there on the internet, books, articles, and of course many, many experts, both in Madison, Wisconsin and far beyond. So I hope this gives you a starting point if you choose to learn more, and you can consider yourself well warned about all the challenges associated with this kind of process.